welcome Nick Best.
Thanks, everyone. Before I start, I just realized the questionable wisdom of using a red font on some of my presentation here. It looks invisible. This says Venus retrograde stations, this says Venus direct stations, and I'll just have to, any other text that isn't visible to you when the screen comes up, I'll just have to tell you what it says, and you'll just have to take my word for it. Thanks all for coming. My name is Nick Dagan. I'm from Montreal, Canada. Researcher, writer, and all-around astrological obsessive. And I've given a few talks. I've never spoken to a crowd this big, so I'm going to come clean. I am picturing you all naked. I just want you to know, you guys look fabulous. Now, today's talk is mainly about transits. Retrograde transits, although I'm also looking at some superior conjunctions. Do people know what a superior conjunction is? Maybe I should take a show of hands. Anyone not know? Okay. Well, when it comes to the planets that are between the Earth and the Sun, Venus and Mercury, they can make conjunctions to the Sun while they're retrograde and while they're conjunct. And, while they're direct. And when either Venus or Mercury make a conjunction to the Sun and they're direct, that's called a superior conjunction. If they're conjunct the Sun in a chart when they're retrograde, that's called an inferior conjunction. So, what we're going to be looking at are some transits in a sort of cyclical context. We're going to be starting with Venus, because Venus is really, really easy. Venus makes 5 retrogrades in an 8-year period. It also makes 5 superior conjunctions in an 8-year period. And as you can see, this isn't devil worship here or anything. This is what the cycle ultimately looks like. If you could see, again, the glyphs aren't here. Well, I'll just run through these. The last 5 Venus retrograde stations we've had, actually I've left out one because I moved this a little while ago. We had a retrograde at 5 Virgo in July of 99. We had a retrograde at 17 Aries in March of 2001, 15 Scorpio in October of 2002, 25 Gemini in May of 2004, and 1 Aquarius in late 2005. That actually was the last one. The next one will be this summer in July in Virgo again. Now, this summer, of course, is 8 years after July of 1999. And if you look in your ephemeris, you will see, if you go back to July, August of 91, 83, 75, 67, 59, and so forth, you will see that throughout the 20th century, Venus has gone retrograde in Virgo, and then goes direct about a month later, just over a month later, 40 days later, well, in this case in Leo. And the same thing here with the Aries retrograde, March of 2001, it goes retrograde in Aries. If you look back at 1993, 1985, 1977, and so forth, Venus went retrograde in Aries. So it's this very precise thing. It's only at the next 8-year cycle, it'll happen 2 days earlier and 2 zodiacal degrees earlier. So gradually over time, it does shift, but in the context certainly of one person's given lifetime, or in the context even just of a given century, it's pretty much exact. And I'm always telling people this is really, really easy to memorize, and I strongly encourage people to do it because you can really look like you know your stuff. Because it looks kind of amazing to people when you can tell them their Venus on, they tell you their birthday, and yet it's a very easy thing to do. Now with the superior conjunctions, it's basically the same thing, except that it happens 4 years after and 4 years before the retrograde. So we have these 2 8-year cycles that sort of overlap. So just as Venus went retrograde in 1999 in Virgo, if you look at 2003, the Sun was conjunct Virgo during the summer. And similarly, 2005, in March, April, the Sun was conjunct Venus in Aries. So the conjunctions happen in the same sign as the retrogrades, and that's it makes it all more easy. So you've got these 2 sort of overlapping cycles. And what we're going to be doing, I'm going to be moving on to Mars. Actually, most of today's talk is about Mars and not Venus. That's why I'm wearing the red tie. Well, this was actually a white tie. I just had to kill a few people. Anyway, so yeah, we're going to get started. What I'm basically going to be doing is I'm going to be showing you some people's biographies. I'm going to start off with a little history and then move on to some biographies and show you how this sort of a given planet, when it goes retrograde or when it makes a superior conjunction, tends to be this timing thing in a person's life. I'll leave it up to you to decide if you think this is really relevant to a given individual's life, and I think I've made some pretty good cases here. I'll do my best to show you. Now, first slide I'm going to show you here, just to go a little further into the Venus retrogrades. As I said, stations 5 times during an 8-year cycle. Synodic cycle, that just means relative to the sun, planet's cycle relative to the sun. A retrograde for Venus, the retrograde period lasts 40 days, but then we also have what's called the shadow period. Before and after a retrograde, a given planet will move through, well, the shadow before the retrograde, it'll move through the degrees that it's going to go retrograde in. And then after the retrograde, it has to move direct through those same degrees again. Now, for Venus, the shadow period lasts about 30 days. So you've got 30 days before the retrograde, 40 days of retrograde, and then 30 days after. Count it up, it's 100 days. So, when you've got 5 retrogrades in 8 years, you're talking about 500 days out of 8 years, 8 times 365 plus 2. I'm not terribly good at math, but it winds up being somewhere between 1/6 and 1/7 of total time. So that's it's a small segment of total time. And when I show you some of the things that happen during this cycle, you'll realize, well, okay, this is a very sort of interesting phenomenon that so many events related to either a given individual or to a given subject will occur during this part of time. So we are going to start with a little U.S. history. I should start by saying that I'm Canadian, so there's nothing I love more than coming down here and talking about when I'm in Canada, I do Canadian history. But all right, so we're going to start with a few scandals. This guy's Joe McCarthy. Jeez, I used a red font. This is all going to be terrible. Oh, God. All right. So,
time makes up for it.
Okay, fair enough. February 1950, Joe McCarthy stood up before a crowd in Wheeling, West Virginia, and announced that he had a big, long list of communists. It was in December of 1954 that the Senate finally censured him for a lot of the activities, all the stuff he was doing in those intervening years. And in December of 54, Venus had just stationed direct in Scorpio. So there was a real sort of, the whole McCarthyism affair began under a Venus retrograde. It also sort of ended under a Venus retrograde. Moving right ahead here. Okay, now I'm not even set. Can you move it a little over to the right a bit? Is that possible? This was the Bay of Pigs. Oh, it's just cutting it off entirely. Okay. No, that's fine. In April of 1961, there was a failed attempt to take Cuba back from Castro. Venus was retrograde here in Aries. This was a big embarrassment to the Kennedy administration at the time. And then at the very next Venus retrograde in Scorpio, in October of 1962, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. Another sort of part 2 of what had gone on at the previous retrograde. Moving right ahead. June of 1972, when Venus was in an inferior conjunct the Sun, retrograde, we had burglars arrested at Watergate. And by the next Venus retrograde, now Nixon didn't resign under a Venus retrograde, but in February of 74, this is when Congress voted to pursue, to at least pursue the impeachment affair. So this was the beginning of the end, if you will. And Venus was retrograde in Capricorn. Moving right ahead here, remember this guy. On October 5th, 1986, a plane crashed. It was shot down by rebels in Nicaragua, and it exposed what would become known as the Iran-Contra affair. Venus was just about to go retrograde in Scorpio. It was pretty close to its station at that point, and that opened up that whole affair. Sorry? Did someone say something?
It was a covert operation.
It was a covert operation, yes. Okay. Oh, I see, because it's Scorpios. All right. The very next Venus retrograde, we had a little affair. An Iranian Airbus was accidentally shot down by a U.S. warship. Venus was retrograde in Gemini. And then 2 retrogrades later, we had the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings. Venus had just stationed direct in Virgo. February of 93, just as Venus was about to go retrograde in Aries, we had the first World Trade Center bombing. Now, 9/11 was not a Venus retrograde affair, but I mean, this is sort of the beginning of what would become known as 9/11. And those of you who know the 9/11 chart, you know that Venus hit that degree 18 Leo, that the eclipse 2 years earlier had been. A lot of people have speculated that that was quite relevant. Of course, Saturn's about to station direct. And right at the same time, we had another little scandal going on. The Waco affair. The siege of Waco actually began not a couple of days after the World Trade Center bombing. But by the time the whole compound burned down in Waco, Venus was... Whoops! I didn't mean to hit that button just yet. Go back. Okay. Venus was retrograde in Aries. And incidentally, David Koresh did have natal Venus retrograde as well. Next thing up we got here, this was a bombing at Khobar Towers, June 1996. Venus was retrograde in Gemini. We got a lot of bombings here. The next thing, this was a plane that went down you remember this flight in Long Island that some people thought might have been shot down with a bazooka. Venus was also, had just stationed direct in Gemini then. And not long after that, we had a bombing at the Olympics in Atlanta. And Venus was still in its post station in Gemini. And then this affair. Everyone remember this guy? When the Monica Lewinsky story broke, Venus was retrograde in Capricorn. That's about all I have to say on that, although it's a pretty Venus retrograde type of event. And now this guy. I'll just run through it. Basically, a lot of the key points. Now, the invasion of Iraq was not a Venus retrograde affair, but you'll see that basically a lot of the sort of starts and turning points in his administration also happened during Venus retrogrades. Number one, this is for when he but basically overturned the Kyoto Accord, declined to participate in the Kyoto Accord in March of 2001. Venus was retrograde in Aries. The very next time, September 2002, just as Venus was about to go retrograde in Scorpio, this is when he went to the UN and asked for a coalition. So this, in a lot of ways, is sort of the official beginning of what would become the invasion of Iraq. And you can see Kofi Annan was terribly thrilled with what was going on there. Well, that does look better, thank you. Okay. This thing. Now, this is Venus retrograde. A woman holding a guy on a leash. This is when the scandal was revealed on 60 Minutes, and Venus was just about to go retrograde in Gemini. And then, and this is interesting. This is in December 2005. This is when the whole government spy scandal was uncovered. I was kind of surprised that this was a big deal. I presumed everyone knew that the government here always spied on people. For some reason, people got morally outraged, and I don't blame them. But this was just virtually to the day that Venus was going retrograde in Aquarius. And what's funny is the first time I gave the Venus retrograde talk, it was in May of 2005 at NORWAC, and I said, well, if you want to look at the next government scandal, it'll probably be the next Venus retrograde. Of course, I hadn't counted on Katrina. But in terms of the sort of the ongoing things related specifically to the administration, this was indeed sort of the next big deal to come up. And there was another little event that happened during this Venus retrograde. Your vice president shot a guy in the face. And I should tell you that if you know your U.S. history, you know this is not the first time a vice president has shot someone. Way back when. In 1804, just as Venus was about to go retrograde in Leo, Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton and killed him. And he was the Dick Cheney of his day, I guess. So enough of that. Oh no, don't turn those back on. Turn them on. You just turn that on.
We need the light to see you for the camera.
Otherwise, you're going to be a shadow.
Well, I'd rather people see this than
Okay.
No, can't see our notes.
You
Okay.
can see? All right. Yeah. Okay. Moving right along. I'm just going to go I'm going to go a little more specific here. When you look at the U.S. relative to the Cold War and the Soviet Union, you also get some very interesting Venus retrograde affairs. Just before the whole Watergate thing broke out in '72, when Venus was retrograde in Cancer, Nixon and Brezhnev signed the SALT I Treaty. And you'll see why this is relevant soon enough. About 10 years later, during a superior conjunction, you see Venus is not retrograde, but the Sun conjunct Venus within 2 degrees. This is when Brezhnev died. That's not a big deal in itself until you consider what followed. At the very next Venus retrograde, Andropov, the guy who replaced Brezhnev, in August of '83, he basically disappeared from public eye. He would die in February, which was not a Venus retrograde. The last time anyone saw him was in August during this Venus retrograde that goes from Virgo to Leo. And then not long after that, you remember I showed you the US shot down the Iranian Airbus? Well, this is the Russian version of that. The Soviets shot down a Korean airliner while Venus was retrograde in Leo. And meanwhile, the Soviet General Secretary was nowhere to be found. He eventually died, as I said, in February of '84, and he was replaced by another guy. And that guy didn't last very long. He died a year later when Venus was just about to go retrograde in Aries, and that's when we got the great Mikhail Gorbachev as the new General Secretary of the Soviet Union. Now, if you think about this, March of '85, he wound up meeting with Reagan for the first time in Geneva later in '85, but the real important meeting was in Reykjavik in October of '86, just as Venus was about to go retrograde in Scorpio. That plane that wound up triggering the Iran-Contra affair that had just crashed a week before, but this is the same period. And this was really the clincher meeting. This is when Reagan sort of pulled out his insane Star Wars thing, and Gorbachev said, you know, those Americans, they might just do it. And things started to change from this moment onward. And at the very next Venus retrograde, I love showing Americans a picture of Reagan standing in front of the Statue of Liberty. I just saw that. Here we go. Venus was retrograde in Gemini, and Reagan went to the Soviet Union for the first time and spoke to people there. And this was when another big. You remember I showed you the SALT I Treaty was signed during the Venus retrograde in Gemini in '72, and this was sort of another big treaty signing. Diplomacy affair, and there you go, Venus retrograde in Gemini. And as for the Soviets, this is a funny event. This is 2 retrogrades later. There was actually a KGB attempt to overthrow Boris Yeltsin that was thankfully shot down. Venus was retrograde in Virgo. This one is interesting to me because I was in East Berlin at the time, and we didn't know, if the wall was going to be back up when we tried to get out or something. We thought we might be stuck. Anyway, so there, that's that. Now, that's my little recap through history. I just wanted to give you guys an idea of how this cycle works and how it sort of times things. It's not about good, it's not about bad, it's just about things happening on a certain kind of schedule. Different planets seem to time things in a certain way. And this is something we don't really, we understand the outer planet transits really well, but we don't really pay enough attention to what these guys do, and they can easily be just as powerful. Now I'm going to move into a few biographies. I'm going to show you one or two quick Venus examples, and then I'm going to move into Mars. And hopefully I'll have time for that. First guy I'm going to talk about, do you all know who Roman Polanski is? Okay. I love using Roman Polanski because he's a great person for an astrologer to study, because there are times in his life where you feel tremendous compassion for him. And then there are times when, frankly, he's someone that we would think of as a monster. And that's, that's a human being for you, right? It doesn't get any more human than that. Natally, he does not have a Venus retrograde, and it doesn't seem particularly, Venus does rule his ascendant, and pay close attention to this Mars-Uranus opposition, because that's where things are going to get really interesting. Roman was born in Paris. He's ethnically a Pole, from Poland, but his parents were Polish, in other words, but he was born in Paris. However, when he was 3.5, his family moved back to Poland. And this would have been, the biographies say it's in early 1937. Now, Venus went retrograde in Aries between March and May of 1937. And this is, most of my charts that I'm showing you today are very exactly timed. This one is a bit of a conjecture, but when you see the overall context, you'll see I might be forgiven for taking a little leap here. This is actually, this is a chart for Jack Nicholson's birth, because Jack Nicholson was born in April of 1937, and since they were good friends and worked together, and actually Jack Nicholson winds up being a key player in one of the stories we're going to be looking at later, I figured I'd just put his chart to show you that in early 1937, Venus was in fact retrograde in Aries, and this is certainly the time period that Polanski's family moved back to Poland. And this was, in the end, rather an unfortunate choice, because, of course, the Nazis invaded the country a few years later. Polanski's parents wound up both being hauled off to a concentration camp, And he spent his life, I mean, he was born in 1933. Poland was invaded in 39, so he was 6 years old. And from the age of 6 to about 11 or what have you, he was basically on his own. He was roaming the forest, or sometimes he was in Krakow in the ghetto, and he was getting shot at by Nazis. And I mean, just imagine being that age and on your own that way. It's one of the most dreadful childhood stories I've ever heard. So that was his experience. Now, I don't have a chart from the next thing I want to talk about, but in the spring of 1945, when Poland was liberated, it was liberated in February of 45, Polanski's parents were let out of the concentration camp, but it took him a while. Well, sorry, his father was. His mother died, and it took Polanski about 2 months to learn that his mother died, and that was in April of 1945, by which time Venus was retrograde in Aries again. So this was a sort of completion from what had happened when the family had moved there, sort of a tail end to that story. But I'm going to move in. This is just the sort of preliminary stuff. The really interesting stuff happens now. Now, of course, one of the things Polanski's most famous for is the fact that his wife was murdered by members of the so-called Manson family. Now, the Manson murders themselves did not occur during Venus retrograde, but a really crucial event in the timeline did. On this day, March 23rd, 1969, Charles Manson went to this address where the Polanskis had just moved into and where the murders would occur 5 months later. And he actually encountered Sharon Tate, Polanski's wife, and a photographer, and he was sort of told to get lost, and the photographer told him, yeah, get lost and take that exit there on the side, which of course was the side exit that the family would later enter. So this is the beginning of Manson was there looking for someone else, and it's sort of a horrible coincidence. But you can basically say that from this day forward, Sharon Tate's days are numbered. And I might add that the whole reason Manson is in prison today, because as some of you may know, he was not present for the actual murders. The whole reason he was convicted is because the prosecutor was able to establish motive just by the fact that he was here this day. So if you're going to challenge me on this piece of data, you risk freeing Charles Manson from prison. So watch yourself. All right, now exactly 8 years later, the other thing that Polanski is most famous for, he raped a 13-year-old girl. This was in March 10th, 1977. Venus is just about to go retrograde in Aries. A lot of you probably know the story. He was sent for psychiatric evaluation, and then about a year later, during the superior conjunction, I might add, in early 1978 of Sun Venus, he fled the country and went to France, and to this day he's still wanted by authorities here. Now I'm jumping ahead a long ways here. In 1993, Spielberg's got this movie, Schindler's List, that he wants to see made. He just wants to produce it, and he actually approaches Polanski to direct it, because Polanski, of course, has direct experience of this whole thing. And Polanski says, no, thank you, that's a little too traumatizing for me, I just don't think I can handle making a movie about the war. Thank you very much, Stephen. So, shortly after that, Stephen decides he's going to direct the movie himself. This is, the filming begins March 1st, 1993, and Venus is just about to go retrograde in Aries. Yet, 8 years later, Roman decides he is ready to make his own movie about his experiences when he witnessed during the war. And in February, this chart is for when he actually starts shooting the ghetto scenes, but it's in late February to mid-April that he shoots the movie The Pianist, which a lot of you might have seen. And Venus was retrograde in Aries when he filmed it. So here you got, now I've never met Roman Polanski. I don't really know, what his favorite food is or what have you, but I will take a leap here, and I will say these are probably the most important events in his life. You can challenge me if you want, but it's a good bet. It's a good bet. This film, of course, wound up getting him nominated. I think he even won for the Oscar, and which is a big deal. And it's a pretty, even for an accomplished filmmaker like him, it's a masterpiece amongst his works. And so you see these, and then you've got the death of his mother, the family moving to Poland. You've got the murder of his wife. And this whole thing that wound up sending him into exile. And all these events seem to be governed by a rhythm, by this one particular Venus retrograde. Now I'm going to give you another example here real quick, and then I want to move on to Mars. I'm probably eating up a lot of my time, unfortunately, but we'll do what we can here. Next person I want to talk about, but this I'm going to do really quick. This is a guy named Billy Corgan. Anyone know who he is? Smashing Pumpkins, right. He is the singer, guitarist, leader of a band called Smashing Pumpkins that existed through most of the 1990s. His Venus is in Aries. It's not retrograded. In 1967, Venus didn't go retrograde until the summer, so there's nothing striking about his natal Venus. In fact, he's got a Mars retrograde, which I'll be getting into later, but not regarding him. But we get a similar sort of thing here. Moving back along, I'll just give you a brief outline of his chronology. The main, well, I'll get to that in a second. Just as he's starting the band Smashing Pumpkins, he's got a friend that he's worked in a record store with named James Ehod, and they're going to start a band named Smashing Pumpkins, but there's just the two of them. But on this day, May 7th, 1988, just as Venus is about to go retrograde in Gemini, he meets this woman, Darcy Retzky, who will become the bass player in the band not too long after. Shortly after this, he and James Ehod play their debut as the Smashing Pumpkins. This is the first time, any musicians called Smashing Pumpkins play a gig. And Venus is just stationed direct in Gemini. This is just about 2 months after he met Darcy. Shortly after this, that woman Darcy joins the band, and then shortly after that, they get a drummer named Jimmy Chamberlain, who I don't have his birth time, but this is his birthday, June 10th, 1964, and he has Venus retrograde in Cancer, which is in the same 8-year cycle, even though those other cycles were in Gemini. This, you can see it's in early Cancer, so it's in 1964 is in the same 8-year cycle as 1988. So it's interesting that he winds up joining the band. You'll see very soon why it gets all the more interesting. Now I'm gonna run through all the Venus retrogrades in the Smashing Pumpkins career, but the main thing, this is sort of like Polanski, where you get one of the retrogrades is really, really profound. Well, there's actually two. The Virgo retrograde is also very important, which you'll see in a minute. In 1991, in my hometown of Montreal, the Smashing Pumpkins were playing a gig, and someone threw a bottle at Billy Corgan, and my friend Melissa Oftemar was in the audience and was really enjoying the show and felt really bad that this bottle got thrown at him. So she went up to Billy, and they met, and they found out they had the same birthday, and Melissa's really into astrology. She was actually partly responsible for getting me into astrology. And they struck up a friendship, and they kept in touch. And Venus was just about to go retrograde in Virgo at the time, and this will be important later on, as you'll see. The very next Venus retrograde is not a big deal. They filmed a concert that they would release on a video. It's sort of interesting. And the next one isn't particularly important. They released a CD that was a bunch of sort of a compilation of old tracks. Not particularly interesting, but now it's 8 years later. The band is now a huge international success. Venus is about to go retrograde in Gemini, and the first in a series of tragedies occurs for the band. A young girl is killed in a mosh pit. Everyone know what a mosh pit is? We could start one here. A girl is killed in a mosh pit, and this is an obvious setback for the band. And then not long after that, their keyboard player dies of a heroin overdose. This is just as Venus is stationing direct in Gemini, that same cycle that the band began under. And this winds up, see, remember, the drummer, this is the drummer's chart on the inside, Jimmy Chamberlain, he's got the Venus retrograde in Cancer in the same cycle. Because again, 1964, 88, and 96 are all part of that same 8-year cycle. And this has terrible consequence for him because, there he is, they wind up firing him from the band. So that's that. They have to move on without their drummer because he's got this drug problem. Now, the very next retrograde is interesting in itself because there's something with these retrogrades with this band where people wind up leaving or doing things on their own or fighting with each other. At the very next Venus retrograde, the Smashing Pumpkins aren't doing anything, but their guitarist, James Ehod, that started the band with Billy Corgan, releases a solo album. The two of them do a couple of gigs together where, Billy Corgan goes on and plays a few songs, and then James Ehod goes on and plays a few songs. So it's sort of interesting in that regard. But then at the next Venus retrograde, remember Melissa Oftemar met Billy Corgan when Venus went retrograde in Virgo in 91. At the very next Venus retrograde of that cycle in 99, the bassist Darcy quits the band, and Melissa wound up replacing her in the band. So she met Billy under the 8 years previously, and then here we go, 8 years later, she winds up joining the band. Now, eventually the band broke up, and all kinds of things happened. But what happened, that same Venus retrograde, 8 years after the whole heroin overdose and mosh pit tragedy stuff, a couple of things happen. Well, this is just sort of interesting. I thought Billy Corrigan starts doing. He starts reporting on Chicago Cubs games for local Chicago radio. I don't know what that's about, but things got really interesting. He had recently in the press been bad-mouthing his former bandmates in Smashing Pumpkins. And shortly after this, June 3rd, 2004, on his website, he wrote an apology. He wrote this heartfelt apology to James Iha for sort of dissing him a couple of months earlier. And he sort of let loose and he said, I've never been ready to let the Smashing Pumpkins go. And the band was my life and I wasn't prepared for it to end. And I'm just a bit angry and bitter over that, which is very interesting because at the next Venus retrograde, we found out that Billy and Jimmy Chamberlain, the drummer who'd been fired from the band, have just signed a management deal and are going to be making an album as the Smashing Pumpkins. And this was at the next Venus retrograde in Capricorn. And interestingly, this album is going to be coming out this July, just as Venus goes retrograde in Virgo. So that's our little Smashing Pumpkins story. Now I'm going to be moving on to Mars. How am I doing for time now? Half an hour? Okay. All right, I'm going to try and be quick about this. Now, on Mars, the Mars retrograde cycle is not as 45 minutes. Excellent. Okay, good. You guys are in for a treat. The Mars cycle isn't quite as even as the Venus one. I mean, you saw how that Venus just goes on an even 8-year cycle, and apart from the 2 zodiacal degree difference, it's a pretty exact thing. A Mars cycle is basically 15 years, but you wind up getting it about 15 degrees earlier than it had been at the previous degree. So you have to sort of watch a little closer, and it's not as easy to memorize. And I realize this just looks like a lot of numbers to you. To me, this is poetry, but but it's not terribly important. If you really want to understand more about the Mars retrograde cycle, just open up your ephemeris and you'll figure it out. What we're going to get into is more of this sort of biographical material. You guys all know this man, right? No? Elvis. Okay, Elvis's chart is interesting. He's got Mars and Libra square the Sun. It's a bit wide, but as we'll see, there's a lot of things in Elvis's chronology that respond to Mars much the same way that we saw some of the other people respond to Venus, but in an even more profound way because it's virtually every retrograde. And superior conjunction. Remember, I'm also going to be discussing superior conjunctions. Okay, the story all starts when Elvis wants to record a song for his mother's birthday. He goes into local Sun Studios in Memphis and records a song called My Happiness. Because Elvis is a real mama's boy, of course, and Mom thought it was a real treat. The Sun was conjunct Mars at the time. Now, because Elvis recorded the song in the studio, he wound up getting the attention of the guy who owned the studio, who thought it might be a good idea to, turn this young man into a recording artist. So a year later, Elvis recorded what would be his first single, just as Mars was retrograde in Sagittarius, a song called That's All Right. Don't ask me to sing it for you, please, and, if you don't know it. And this launches, this is when he winds up for the first time playing with the two musicians who will be key to his 1950s career. So this is the real beginning of Elvis as a recording artist, Mars retrograde in Sag. Not long after this, just later that month, he plays his first big concert with those musicians, the very day that Mars stationed direct in Sagittarius. And what happened on this day, Elvis was really nervous. Apparently he didn't know the whole thing about imagining your audience naked. And he was really nervous and his legs were shaking. And the girls were going nuts. And Elvis came off stage and he said, "Oh God, I don't know why they're reacting like that." The guys in the band said, "Well, Elvis, just go with it. I mean, this is going to work out." And apparently they were right. So, a year later, at the next Sun-Mars superior conjunction, Elvis got a manager, this guy Colonel Tom Parker, who some of you may have heard of. And this is going to be the Svengali who really turns Elvis into a star, and you can see them monkeying around with cigars. So sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. And, Elvis starts to get some attention, and in 1956, actually interestingly, during the Venus retrograde in June of 1956, he does some TV shows, and his first national TV shows. He's been, he's been doing some local TV. And Ed Sullivan says, well, this vulgar guy isn't going to be on my TV show. But eventually he has to sort of change his mind when he realizes how popular Elvis is. But shortly before that happens, Elvis records Love Me Tender, which is going to be the theme song to one of his first movies, because he's starting to get into movies here. Mars is retrograde. And just a short period after this, September 9th, while Mars is still retrograde, Elvis makes the first of what will be 3 appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show. And folks, the younger people here who don't know about this was a big deal at the time. Turn to your closest older person. They'll fill you in. A few months after this, now, the young people are really going to find this funny. A few months later, he makes his 3rd appearance on Ed Sullivan. This actually isn't a Sun-Mars superior conjunction or retrograde, but it is a square, which remember Elvis has natally. And on this day, Elvis is filmed from the waist up on Ed Sullivan because the waist down has just been freaking America out too much. So I threw this in, even though it's not part of the retrograde. There'll be another one like this that I threw in just because it's interesting to the chronology. Oh, okay. A year later, now Elvis by this time is a big star, and this is something we're going to see more of. On this day, he throws a big concert in his birth town, Tupelo, Mississippi, to fund a youth recreation center in the area. Now, Elvis became filthy rich, of course, by being a rock and roll star, and he was notoriously generous with his money. We're going to see a few other examples of this. The Sun and Mars were in a superior conjunction at the time that he gave this concert, and as you'll see, this becomes something of a trend with Elvis. But moving right ahead, a year later, just as Mars is about to station retrograde in Gemini, Elvis arrives at the German army base. He has to put his rock and roll career on hold for the time being and be in the military for a couple of years. And interestingly, some of you may know Elvis died addicted to drugs, and he did not become addicted to drugs because he was a rock and roll star. He became addicted to speed because he was on guard duty in Germany, and his sergeant was feeding him speed. So it's kind of something people don't really know. But so this is the beginning of that. Mars goes retrograde in Gemini, and Elvis is in the army. And while he's in Germany, a year later, he meets a very young girl named Priscilla Beaulieu. That's at the next Sun-Mars conjunction. I don't know the exact date. I know it's November 59 that they met. So this is another instance where, but regardless, throughout November 59, the Sun and Mars were in a superior conjunction.
May I add something to that? May I add something to that? They had a perfect chart together because they married on a bad day.
Oh, wait, I'm getting there. You want to come here with us? I'm kidding. Thank you. All right. A year later, Elvis is done with the army and he's going to go back to his recording career. But things are different now. He's going to start. He's made a few movies in the past, but now he's really just going to be a film star. And he starts this next Mars retrograde, just as Mars has gone retrograde. This is virtually the day of the station. 2 of his first movies in this period of his career come out. The first is G.I. Blues, because he's, of course, just gotten out of the army. And another one where he plays a Native American called Flaming Star. So these first... Thank you very much. All right. So we got these next 2 Mars retrogrades. I don't have anything for the superior conjunction of 61. But at the next Mars retrograde, he's still dating this girl, Priscilla Beaulieu. Now, in the summer of 62, she came and visited him in Memphis, and the romance is rekindled. And then at Christmas, Mars went retrograde. This chart is for, the outer chart is for Christmas of 62. And she comes to see him for Christmas. And it's over Christmas that they decide she's going to move in with him, even though she's still in high school. So she goes back to Germany, tells her parents, I'm moving in with Elvis in Memphis. They give her their blessing, sort of. And by early 63, while Mars is still retrograde, she winds up moving in with Elvis. Now this is interesting. A year after this, at the next Sun-Mars superior conjunction, and I am actually going to be going to Paul McCartney after this if I still have time. The next Sun-Mars superior conjunction, Elvis watches these British nincompoops on the Ed Sullivan Show stealing his thunder. And you might notice also he was having a Saturn return at the time as well, which is kind of interesting. This apparently wasn't a great day for Elvis. They did get a telegram saying that he was congratulating them, but that was really just sent by Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, and Elvis had nothing to do with that. Elvis was apparently really, really bothered by these guys, because they were stealing his thunder, as I said. So this was interesting. And then remember I told you about Elvis's generosity. A couple of days after this, he had this bizarre incident. He bought a yacht that had belonged to Franklin Roosevelt, and he was trying to give it to the March of Dimes, but it was going to cause this tax hassle. So they declined to accept this yacht as a donation. And then he tried to donate it to another organization. They said no. And finally, he wound up giving it to a children's hospital, and they sold it. It was kind of like, he's got this expensive yacht that belonged to a U.S. president. He's trying to donate it to charity, and no one would accept it. And of course, we still have the Sun-Mars conjunction there. Now, okay, here, do you want to talk about this, Miss? The next, when Elvis finally tied the knot with Priscilla Goya, because of course now she's no longer underage, Mars was retrograde in Libra. And look, they're having a great old time now. I try to pick goofy pictures if I can. And then a year later, Elvis decides he's had enough with making these cheesy movies. He's going to go back into rock and roll, and he tapes a comeback special for TV. And the Sun, along with Venus, we've got a double superior conjunction there. In June of '68, he tapes this special. And this is a lot of Elvis fans think of this as a real highlight of his career. And then we move on to the low point of his career, the Vegas period. The very next year, just shortly after Mars is stationed direct, Elvis starts playing what will be the second sort of half of his career, his Vegas period. This is the first. He had played Vegas once before in the early '60s, but this is the beginning of him as a sort of Vegas showpiece kind of performer. This is the beginning of the white suits. I know he's not wearing a white suit in this photo. The beginning of the white suits and the karate kicks and all that stuff. And interestingly, this is exactly 15 years to the month after he began his recording career, so you've actually got the actual synodic cycle making a completion there. So, and you remember when they were going to make postage stamps of Elvis, they were trying to decide, should we have the young Elvis or the old Elvis? So I always find it striking, like this is the beginning of the old Elvis, and I find it striking that it sort of kicks off exactly 15 years to the month after the young Elvis began his career. So that's that. Now, on to Saturn times. I've skipped the 1971 retrograde. I can't really find, I found some interesting anecdotes, but nothing really worth talking about. But the next Mars retrograde after that in '73, Elvis and Priscilla actually get divorced. Their divorce is finalized during Mars retrograde. And just a couple of days after that, Elvis is hospitalized with a bunch of I've written pneumonia, pleurisy, and enlarged colon, but there were even other things that he was hospitalized for. And this would be the first in a series of this is when his health is really starting to unravel, when Mars is retrograde and Mars here. And I just had one more thing to show you. Remember I showed you a couple of charts for when he was donating things to charity during Sun-Mars superior conjunctions. This is sort of a famous day in Elvis lore. Elvis bought a lot of people cars, but on this day, he bought a lot of cars. And he gave them all away to like policemen and hangers-on, and Mars was retrograde in Gemini. This is the last Mars retrograde of his life, because he died the next year. I'm not going to go into his death. There isn't anything terribly Martian about it, but nonetheless, there's something very interesting in his chronology where you see these Mars retrogrades creeping up at interesting times. Now, the next person I'm going to talk about is a lot more contemporary. This time now, the older people may have to ask the younger people about this person. Okay, Britney Spears. I know we all. Now I'm not gonna. I know she's going through a rough time, so I almost feel bad about talking about her. I typically actually don't really do topical material. I like to do things that are a bit older, so that I'm not intruding on an ongoing situation. But Britney, in her brief years, has shown to have something similar to Elvis, where you see the Mars cycle really showing itself, making a big presence. So I'm gonna go through this. In much the same way and try to be compassionate about it, although we'll have a few laughs at her expense as well. Brittany auditioned for the Mickey Mouse Club. She got her career, she'd done a couple of off-Broadway shows, but her real beginning in show business, as people know, is when she was on the Mickey Mouse Club as a kid. This is when she auditioned for the show, and Mars had just stationed direct this day. The auditions went from February 19th to the 21st, 1993, and Mars has just stationed direct like this very week, I think, and maybe not the exact date, but basically we're right there at that time. And this is when things get launched for her. Now we're going to jump ahead a few years when she looks a little. I might stand behind the podium when I do this. No, I'm just kidding. All right. This is another instance. This is when she released her first CD. It's not a Mars Superior conjunction or retrograde, but the Sun was conjunct Mars in a very conspicuous place along with a Saturn opposition. So I just thought I'd throw in this in there because this is when she's just starting to become known. Shortly after this, though, just as her career is taken off, Mars is just about to go retrograde in Scorpio here, and she undergoes knee surgery because she had just hurt her knee. And this is going to be a recurring thing for her. She keeps having knee problems throughout her career. So that's as Mars is going retrograde. Now, while she's recovering from surgery, she doesn't do nothing. First of all, she films a video for her second single, Sometimes, Mars is retrograde in Scorpio there. And then the real interesting event, this is something that was kind of notorious at the time. She was only 17 years old, and she posed for this photo in Rolling Stone, which at the time was sort of scandalous. It seems kind of tame by today's standards. It's funny how time passes. But Mars is retrograde in Scorpio, and this is basically when she becomes a really, really big star, is when this cover comes out. And boom! Shortly after Mars stations direct, she shoots another video for her third single, Crazy. And Mars stationed direct on her Plutos, you see, and the Jupiters here, so it's still very interesting transits to her chart. Okay, jump ahead a year. Now she's a big star by now, and you know she's a big star because her hometown has announced that they're going to open a Britney Spears museum. That's right. No, she doesn't paint. They're putting stuff that pertain to Britney Spears in the museum. This is a Sun-Mars conjunction, and another big thing happens here is she plays on the Today Show at Rockefeller Center. It's a huge crowd. New York just gets basically shut down for blocks and blocks, and it's one of the most watched Today Show episodes in the show's history. The Sun and Mars are conjunct there. Now, jump ahead a year. At the next Mars retrograde, Britney Spears and her boyfriend Justin Timberlake, there was a rumor that they'd been killed in a car crash. These radio DJs, just said it as a prank, but it wound up like their families wound up hearing it and not knowing it. So for almost a day, people thought they were dead, and this was a Mars retrograde, so that was kind of horrific for them. And then a year after that, at the next Sun-Mars Superior conjunction, Britney Spears, you can't see this photo's really faded, but she's actually giving you all the finger. Hope that's not too rude. She goes to Mexico to do a couple of concerts, and things just go terribly. She gets caught giving the finger to the camera and that sort of scandal. And then she has to cancel a concert after a couple of songs because a lightning storm starts, and people are booing her, and she gets booed out of the country. It's the beginning of things really starting to come apart in a big way. Now, a year later, at the next Mars retrograde in Pisces, this happens. You guys remember this? Say no more. I better stand behind the phone. Okay. So that's that. And then, we have another Sun-Mars square. When she marries Jason Alexander, you remember? No, it's not that Jason. I gotta stop clowning so much. At the next Sun-Mars square, she marries this guy for a couple hours, and I'm sure you all heard about that. But then, at the next Sun-Mars Spirit conjunction, she marries Kevin Federline. And people probably heard about that. When we get to the next square, their reality show starts broadcasting on TV, and everyone realizes that they're crazy. She gives birth to her first son just about 2 weeks before Mars stations retrograde in Taurus. And during that retrograde, she winds up throwing Kevin Federline out of the house for a while, and a couple of things go wrong. Things wound up working out for a little while. And she gave birth to her second son while Mars was on her ascendant. And then shortly after that, she filed for divorce during the next Sun-Mars period conjunction. So that's basically, I mean, she hasn't been alive very long, but in that brief period of time, you know, just in the time she's been a star, you can see that the retrograde and the superior conjunction having an interesting presence in her chronology. And just for curiosity's sake, yes, when she shaved her own head, she had very interesting Mars transit. Mars was on Venus while transiting Venus was opposite Mars. So you got a sort of Mars-Venus thing. When I gave a talk on Venus retrograde in Baltimore a few weeks ago, someone in the audience actually asked me about Brittany related to Venus retrograde, because she thought Brittany was actually born about 3 weeks before Venus stationed retrograde. So she does have like a shadow Venus in her chart. And at the time, I was looking, I had her chronology. I knew of a couple events that happened in her life that pertained to Venus retrograde, but I didn't at the time think they were relevant enough to say, yes, she's one of these Venus retrograde people as well. Since then, I've sort of reviewed the position. I'll show you why. First, I'll show you what I did have. Remember, I showed you she auditioned for the Mickey Mouse Club in February of '93. Well, on this day, April of 1993, I mean, she's only 11 years old, but her hometown celebrated Britney Spears Day. Imagine being 11 years old and your hometown celebrates a day dedicated to you. Venus had just stationed direct in Aries, I think, that day or the day before. And it was the very next day that she went off to Florida to start taping the Mickey Mouse show. So this is another sort of stage at the beginning of her career. Now, exactly 8 years later, she filmed a movie called Crossroads. It's the only movie she'd started. It wound up being a huge bomb for her. But Venus was retrograde in Aries through the duration of the filming, basically. But what's really interesting, these are the only two events I can talk about in terms of Venus retrograde in Aries, but there are no less than three men in her life who have the Venus retrograde in Aries. The first one is her brother, Brian Spears, born in 1977. He's her older brother. He has Venus retrograde in Aries. Number two is this guy, Nigel Dick. He's a video director. He directed her first three videos and another one later. Oops, I did it again. Basically, that first video, she was dressed like a schoolgirl and all that stuff. I mean, he's done the videos that have been sort of really controversial for her. Now, you'll see Venus is in Taurus. That's the same. It's about to go retrograde, and it goes retrograde through Aries. It's that same cycle as 1977 and 93 and 2001 and what have you. And finally, the other thing is this guy, David LaChapelle, the photographer who took that Rolling Stone cover photo of her in her bra and her underwear and stuff. He was also born just as Venus was about to go retrograde in Aries. So I find it interesting that, just men who are involved in her life and her career have that Venus as well. So I thought, before mentioning, it's just the kind of thing you see sometimes. Now we're going to move on to Paul. How am I doing for time now? 25? Okay, I can do this in 25. This is pretty extensive because with Paul, when it comes to the Veals, we have just such an incredible chronology. So unlike with some of the other people, I don't have to skip anything. I'm actually going to be discussing every single Mars retrograde from 1956 until now. You guys ready for that? Better? Okay. Paul natally has Mars conjunct Pluto in the 12th house. It does also, if you use traditional rulerships as I do, rule his lot of fortune. So there are some interesting Mars qualities to his birth chart. But we'll start. Sorry?
Did you say the 12 houses have closer to 11?
I use whole sign houses.
Oh, okay.
Far up.
When you use transits and perfections to the extent I do, it just,
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, okay. But fair enough. I mean, if you use another house system, yes, I suppose you would say 11th house. Fair enough. I'll just explain briefly. I use these as houses, and these are porphyry cusps that just sort of determine angularity of a planet. I don't use them for topical matters. Okay, 1956, just shortly after Mars is stationed direct in Pisces, that same time that Elvis was playing the Ed Sullivan Show, Paul's mother dies of breast cancer. This is a very important part of Beatles lore. Beatles lore is all about dead mothers, because it's only a year and a half after this that John Lennon's mother dies, and Paul and John bond as friends and songwriters over this event. And it even gets weirder if you really know the chronology, because In 1970, George Harrison's mother dies just as he's going to make his first solo album, which basically eclipses John and Paul as songwriters. That album, All Things Must Pass. So there's something about having your mother die that turns you into an awesome songwriter, apparently, from Liverpool. But yeah, this is a real, well, I'd say no more. His mother died and he's a young boy. This is a very terrible event for him. Jump ahead, actually I've skipped one Mars retrograde, 58, but that's not terribly important. 1960, the Beatles are in Hamburg, Germany, and Paul McCartney and their drummer at the time, Pete Best, not related to me, start a little fire in a club, and it winds up getting them kicked out of Germany for a little while. And this fire that they started happens during the Mars retrograde. Jump ahead to 1961, during the Sun-Mars Superior conjunction, we've got yet another Svengali entering the picture. Brian Epstein offers to manage the Beatles, and as I understand, this worked out pretty well for him. Jump ahead a year, the next Mars retrograde, the Beatles wind up releasing what will be, they actually recorded the single during a Venus retrograde, so great art can be made during Venus retrogrades, but during the Mars retrograde, they released their first, not their first single, it's their second single, but it's the first one that's going to go to #1 in the charts and kick off what will become known as Beatlemania. The same retrograde, they also record what will be their first album. You're going to see most of their albums have been done recorded during Sun-Mars conjunctions or Mars retrograde. So during this Mars retrograde, they record their first LP over the course of the day. And they also record their follow-up single, From Me to You, during that Mars retrograde, which will be their next #1 single. Now, I've already looked at this event. Remember, Elvis was watching TV this day and getting all bummed out and having his Saturn return what have you. The Beatles, a year later, during the Sun-Mars Superior conjunction, appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. Excuse me. Oh, and they also recorded their Hard Day's Night album during that Sun-Mars conjunction, just before they filmed the movie. Now, jump ahead a year. Okay, this is a chart. Can you believe it? I've got a chart for when someone begins a vacation. Well, Mars is just stationed retrograde on its ascendant. This is February of 65. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, Paul writes a couple of songs when he's on this vacation. He tends to write songs when he's on vacation. He has a big argument with his girlfriend, and he writes a song called Another Girl, which winds up on the Help soundtrack and is retrograde at the time. Now, what's interesting about this period is Paul's creative output isn't that strong compared to John's. If you listen to the songs that are on the Help album, Paul's got The Night Before and Another Girl. They're perfectly good songs. Anyone else would be proud of writing them. But when you think of who Paul is, they're probably two of his weaker songs in the Beatles era, whereas John is doing, Help and You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. So there's this sort of inequality. But during this Mars retrograde, they filmed the Help movie, and Paul was really working a lot harder. And, actually, I'm just going to take a little side trip. During this time as well, during the Mars retrograde, John Lennon and George Harrison do LSD for the first time. And this winds up leaving sort of Paul out of the picture. So not only is he not producing musically like he'd like to, but now John and Paul are off on this sort of trip without him, and he's feeling sort of excluded for that because it takes him a long time before he finally takes LSD. He also buys a house I think he still owns to this day, or at least until very recently, very close to the Abbey Road studio at Mars retrograde at this time. Yes, I have a chart when the guy bought a house. Oh, okay. Okay, I'm going to get back into the songwriting thing. I'm sorry, folks, I'm screwing up the chronology a bit. I'll get back to that train of thought later. Hopefully I'll have time. A year later, Sun-Mars Superior conjunction, they recorded the Revolver album, Got to Get You Into My Life Here, Eleanor Rigby, 401 Sun-Mars conjunction during all of them. And then a year later, as they're recording Sgt. Pepper, a lot of Sgt. Pepper was recorded during Mars retrograde. We've got Getting Better, She's Leaving Home, and the album cover is shot. And during the same Mars retrograde, he meets Linda McCartney on May 15th, 1967. And shortly after that, they launch the Sgt. Pepper album at a big party. And that's a picture of them having a good time at the party. Mars is retrograde in Libra. Then a year later, they start doing the White Album, and the Sun-Mars is conjunct. And a lot of the White Album is recorded Blackbird here, Sun-Mars conjunction, Obla-Dia, Bla-Da, so far, what have you. Then a year later, the next Mars retrograde, a lot of Abbey Road is recorded during the next Mars retrograde. Here we've got You Never Give Me Your Money, and this is when the beginning of the breakup happens. The other three Beatles sign a contract with this guy, Alan Klein, and Paul decides not to, and they get in a huge fight. And this is really, people sometimes blame the breakup on Yoko or Linda Eastman. It's not. It was all over business, more than anything. It was really this guy who did it. Incidentally, a natal Sagittarius sun, Alan Klein, and Mars was retrograde here in Sagittarius. And this is, even though they're making this great album, Abbey Road, they're really starting to break up at this point. So yeah, there's more Beatles songs from Abbey Road during the Mars retrograde, Golden Slumbers, and that whole medley is put together. So the Beatles break up, and all kinds of things go wrong. And 2 years later, the next Mars retrograde, George Harrison has this concert for Bangladesh, for which he's actually invited all the Beatles. John almost showed up. He literally turned away at the last minute. Ringo was there. And Paul decided, since he was in a big lawsuit with everyone, he wasn't going to show up. So, again, he sort of left out of the picture at the Mars retrograde. And at the same time, a month later, John Lennon releases an album on which he makes terrible fun of Paul McCartney. He has a song called How Do You Sleep, where he accuses Paul of writing Muzak and all this stuff. And George Harrison plays guitar on the song. So, again, his buddies are sort of ganging up on him, and Mars is gestation direct in Aquarius. Now, so far, none of this might seem terribly striking. I just wanted to give you a context for which things happen under. But this is where things start to get really interesting for Paul. A year later, as the Sun and Mars are about to make this superior conjunction, he's arrested for the first time for hashish possession in Sweden. It's a relatively minor thing. He pays a fine, they play a concert that night. It's not a big deal. However, local police in Scotland, where he owns a home, take note of this, and a month later, when the Sun and Mars are in a much closer superior conjunction, they bust his farm and they find him growing marijuana, and he's arrested. But this has big consequences for him later on. But I'll get to that in a second. At the very next retrograde, the next year, McCartney and Wings, during the Mars retrograde in Taurus, record an album in Nigeria, Band on the Run. Up until this time, since the Beatles have broken up, Paul's career is really sort of floundering, and he's not having hits, and people are sort of giving him bad reviews. But this album that he records in Nigeria is going to be a huge commercial and critical success. By his father, it's put out under the Country Hams. It doesn't sell a lot, it's not a big deal. What is interesting is, he was recently asked, out of all the records he's made, what would he take to a desert island with? It was this one. Not a Beatle fan, I guess. I don't know. At the next, just as Mars is about to go retrograde, the Wings begin what will be their first world tour. This will take them to America. First time he's been to tour America since the Beatles. But also, what's very interesting, right at this time as Mars is about to go retrograde, he tries to get a tour of Japan booked. And Japan says, no, we're not letting you in the country because you've been busted for drugs. And I'll get to why that's important in a minute here. But this is, the beginning of a big world tour. Mars is just about to go retrograde in Cancer. This is, okay, I'm just showing that a couple of days later, the Mars was retrograde in Cancer. A year later, he releases a live album of that tour. The tour has been a huge success, and he releases this live album during the Sun-Mars superior conjunction. And then a year after that, this is important, he releases a single called Mull of Kintyre during the Mars retrograde. And what's important about this is, in Britain, as a single, it's not a very good song, I think. I mean, sorry, Paul. It's not a very good song, but what's interesting is it outsells any of the Beatles singles. It becomes the biggest selling single in the UK. And in the context of the Beatles, this is really, really important because they're very competitive with each other. And this is basically his way of saying, well, fellas, I've won. I've eclipsed the Beatles in a way. So that's sort of a victory. It's kind of interesting that it's not all that great a song, but there you go. Next Mars retrograde. The very day that Mars is going retrograde in Virgo, he's finally gotten a visa to tour Japan, and he goes to Japan and he's busted with weed. Okay, now I'm gonna take a few detours here. Hopefully I've got enough time, but you'll notice that we're following the retrograde. Oh, I've killed the. Is this gonna work still? No, it isn't. Oh well. You'll notice that Saturn is on his ascendant. John Lennon had also been busted for drugs back in 1968 when Saturn was in Aries on his ascendant. But indeed, Mars is just about to go retrograde in Virgo. Now, this is where the story gets really, really, really weird. Because that degree, not only is Mars retrograde really strong for Paul, but Mars at 15 Virgo is really, really powerful for him, and I'll show you why. well, okay, he's deported. I'm just showing he's deported a couple of days later from Japan for having the drugs. Mars still at 14 Virgo there. Now, going back, you'll notice Yoko Ono natally. Yoko Ono has natal Mars retrograde in Virgo. Now, what's interesting about this story is a number of biographies report that just before Paul went to Japan, he was in New York, and he called the Lennons, and Yoko answered the phone. He said, "Hello, Yoko, is John there?" Actually, I sound more like George than Paul when I do the deal. But anyway, Yoko says, no, John's not here, he can't come to the phone. He says, Paul says, "Well, Yoko, we're about to go to Japan, and Linda and I are staying at that hotel in Tokyo that you and John love so much, because John and Yoko have been going to Tokyo a lot." And he says, and also I got some dynamite stuff. Shall I come over and give you some? And Yoko says, "No, it's okay. We're not smoking a lot of pot these days." But Yoko also is very apparently proprietary about this hotel in actually I think it was Kyoto, not Tokyo, wherever it was. She gets kind of I don't want Paul and Linda in our hotel room kind of thing. So legend has it that she actually tipped off Japanese authorities. Now I'm not gonna make the accusation. But remember, he got busted when Mars is retrograde in Virgo at 15 Virgo. She natally has Mars retrograde in Virgo at 15 Virgo, and she has been known to be something of a nemesis to this guy. Now this is where the story gets even weirder. Some of you may know that there was a rumor that Paul McCartney was dead. And if you know the lore behind the rumor, the story was that on November 9th, 1966, he died in a car crash. Now, of course, it's not true. But something did happen on November 9th, 1966. John Lennon met Yoko Ono that very day. Now, I've never seen anyone point this out. It's weird. Beatles fans are obsessive about this. I mean, this is, I've been doing this since I was a kid, this whole Beatles dates thing. But no one ever says, it's kind of weird that November 1966 has this sort of double function for these people. But lo and behold, Mars wasn't retrograde, but it was at, 16 Virgo. Okay, so Yoko's having a Mars return, and, there's some weird stuff going on. And indeed, remember I mentioned John Lennon had been busted for drugs? Guess where Mars was when that happened? 16 Virgo. They just finished mixing the White Album, sequencing it. That's what the inner chart is for. And then they were busted for drugs. Saturn at 21 Aries, Lennon's ascendant is 19 Aries. So, you've got these really weird things going on with Mars at 15 Virgo, and it gets even weirder. Well, here, this is just, okay, John Lennon recorded his Plastic Ono band when Mars was at 14 Virgo, but I'm just throwing that in there. This is the weird thing. Remember I was telling you, in early 65, just as Mars is going retrograde in Virgo, that Paul was sort of struggling commercially, and the other guys are doing acid. And while they're filming the movie Help, occasionally he goes to the piano and he's singing this little song, Scramble Days, long Scramble Days, and he can't come up with lyrics for it. And he's asking his friends, have you ever heard this song? Did I write this, or am I just copying it? Then he goes on another vacation. On May 27, 65, he leaves for a vacation to Portugal, and while he's riding in the car on the way to the cottage that he and his girlfriend are renting, Mars at 15 Virgo, he writes the lyrics to Yesterday. This is in his own, there's a book called Many Years From Now, which is basically an autobiography. It's sort of done in an interview style, and he says this is when he wrote those lyrics, and Mars was at 15 Virgo. So there's a really sort of interesting thing here. I know I've sort of taken a detour, but I just have to share this with you. All right, back to the Mars retrogrades. We got another 20 or so years to cover in Paul's life. Hopefully I have enough time. 7? 7? Okay, I can do this in 7. Yeah, really. Okay. 1982, Mars retrograde in Libra. He releases a song called Ebony and Ivory with Stevie Wonder. It sort of rejuvenates his career after the whole drug bust in Japan and everything. Then shortly after that, he records a song with Michael Jackson called The Girl Is Mine. That's going to be on Michael's Thriller album. This is the beginning of the recording of the Thriller album. Mars still retrograde in Libra. And this, of course, is going to be important later on because he has a little tangle with Michael Jackson. Then another pot bust. Now this is interesting. It's not a Sun-Mars conjunction, it's not a Mars retrograde, but it's what we call a recurrence transit. Paul has natal Mars conjunct Pluto in his birth chart, and he's busted in the Barbados, and Mars and Pluto are conjunct in that sign. So it's sort of this little echo of this chart. And it's yet another drug bust. The guy never wins. Then he plays Live Aid. In the 80s, his career is pretty quiet. He doesn't do a lot, but he does play Live Aid during the Sun-Mars superior conjunction. And then just a month after that, while the superior conjunction is still quite close, Michael Jackson buys Northern songs. He basically buys the Beatles catalog, and this is going to be, a lot of you probably know this is sort of a big deal for Paul because he was outbid by Michael Jackson, who was kind of an underhanded bit. Now again, Paul isn't doing much musically, but at the next Mars retrograde, he does play a concert for the Prince's Trust. So that, I mean, he barely does anything else other than release an album. This one, Press, that comes out, that isn't very successful. And then, well, at the next Mars retrograde, his old bandmate George Harrison releases, Paul had tried so hard to keep the Beatles together, and the Traveling Wilburys is like the new band thing. There's all these like non-band people. You got Bob Dylan and Roy Orbison and George himself, and that sort of eclipses Paul at the time. Although Paul does do something interesting when Mars is just going retrograde in the same Pisces. That same week, he releases an album for the Soviet Union only. This album is actually really good. It's just him doing a bunch of rock and roll songs, but it instantly becomes bootlegged, and import copies are selling for. I remember someone buying a copy for like $40. So it becomes kind of this. Even though he can't make his commercial albums sell, he makes this little throwaway album for the Soviet Union. It becomes a really sort of big deal and rejuvenates him. Finally, he does begin a new world tour when Sun and Mars are conjunct. Releases a live album at the next Mars retrograde. Releases his next album at a Mars retrograde. And then, this is important, Paul and Yoko go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to honor John Lennon. And the Sun and Mars had just made their superior conjunction. And it's during this meeting, it's when they're doing this, that Paul goes to Yoko and says, me, George, and Ringo are finally thinking of putting together this Beatles compilation, and we're wondering if you have any tapes of John's songs that maybe we could work on in the studio. And she gives them a couple of tapes. And a month later, they start recording the song Free as a Bird. And then a year later, they record a second one of these songs during the Mars retrograde, Real Love. And then the first anthology came out during the Pluto ingress. It wasn't anything terribly Martian. But then the second ingress, when that song Real Love came out, that was also a Sun-Mars conjunction, along with Saturn there on the Descendant. So it's a very interesting closure for the whole Beatles thing for Paul. Basically they're all getting along at that point. The next Mars retrograde, Paul is knighted by Queen Elizabeth. And then, shortly before the next Sun-Mars conjunction, Linda dies. Now, okay, Sun and Mars are still 6 degrees apart, and they're not in the same sign, so it's not technically a superior conjunction yet. And this is April of 1998. The superior conjunction will be in May of 1998. Now, again, I'm going to take a leap here. I'm pretty sure May of 1998 was a pretty miserable month for Paul, as things turned out, sadly. And then the very next Mars retrograde, he met this lovely lady, Heather Mills. I don't know the exact date, but it was in May of 1999. Mars was retrograde that whole month. And then jumping ahead a few, I've skipped out a few things. I've gone on long enough as it is. I'm just wrapping up here. But just as Mars is about to go retrograde in Taurus, he falls through a stage in Tampa. He's just starting a new concert tour, and he puts down his guitar, and he's going over to where the piano is, and then there's this hole in the stage, and he falls in a little orchestra pit. He wasn't hurt, but it was sort of embarrassing. And then then as Mars did go retrograde, Yoko Ono criticized his music during an awards ceremony. It became this little brouhaha. It wasn't a big deal in the end, but it was another Mars retrograde thing. Now the last slide, this was the last Mars retrograde. The divorce between him and Heather Mills was not announced during a Mars superior conjunction, but what did happen last October during the Sun-Mars conjunction was when these photos of Heather came out, and the whole thing sort of, and some stories, she talked to the press about him being abusive and being drunk and on drugs. Basically, the divorce got a lot nastier during that Sun-Mars conjunction, so I thought that was kind of interesting. It's apparently recently been settled, so that's about it. Anyway, I've taken enough of your time. I'm sure I've gone over my 7 8. No, I haven't? How the hell did I do that?